Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, panel. What to say about Ms. Idamay Denny? There's a whole lot to say. Dr. Idamay Denny received her early education at St. Silas Primary and the Alexandra School. Upon graduation from Alexandra, she entered the field of education, commencing her career as a teacher at the All Saints Girls' School in St. Peter on January 15, 1974, working in the field for the next 46 years until her retirement on December 31st, 2019. Of those 46 years, she spent 16 as a teacher, also serving at Deacon's Primary, Pine Primary, and Ellerton Primary Schools. For the next 20 years, Dr. Denny served in the Ministry of Education as reading specialist, education officer responsible for language arts, senior education officer, and for half of those 20 years as deputy chief education officer. For the final 10 of her 46-year career, Dr. Denny served as a development banker in education with the Caribbean Development Bank. Dr. Denny is the holder of a teacher's certificate with distinction from Edison Teachers Training College, from which she graduated in 1978 as Student of the Year. In 1985, she graduated from the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies, the Bachelor of Arts. With a Bachelor of Arts degree, honors grade, in Literature and Linguistics with Education. She returned to the UWI in 1991, graduating in 1992 with a certificate in Educational Management and Administration, gaining a distinction and graduating as the most outstanding student. In between her stints at UWI, Dr. Denny was awarded an Organization of American States Fellowship to attend Howard University in Washington, D.C. She graduated from Howard in 1987 with the Master of Education degree in Teaching of Reading, achieving a perfect 4.0 grade point average in the process. For her outstanding performance at Howard, she was awarded a graduate assistantship, presented with an award of academic excellence, and was named in Who's Who among international students in American universities and colleges. In 2006, Dr. Denny completed the Certificate of Advanced Graduate Studies in Education Leadership, and in 2008, she successfully defended her dissertation and was awarded the degree of Doctor of Education in Educational Leadership, both at Cambridge College in Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Denny also subsequently completed a diploma in the Management of Change with Cornell University. During the period 1989 to 2000, Dr. Denny served as a part-time lecturer with the Department of Language, Linguistics, and Literature at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, teaching the foundation language courses to first-year students. She has also conducted significant training for teachers and principals in various areas of education over the course of her career. In December 2009, Dr. Denny left the Ministry of Education to join the Caribbean Development Bank as an education specialist, advising on education development across the region. In May 2014, she was promoted to portfolio manager, responsible for education, assuming responsibility for the leadership of the bank's extensive education portfolio, a position which she held until her retirement in December 2019. Dr. Denny has also served locally on a number of boards. She sat on the boards of Springer Memorial, St. Michael, Christ Church Foundation, and the Lester Vaughan Secondary Schools. She's also a member of the board of the Barbados Water Authority and deputy chairman of the Rural Development Commission. She is currently serving as the Deputy Chairman of the Barbados Community College. Dr. Denny's service to education at the policy level also extended regionally and internationally. She represented Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean on the Committee on Education and the Inter-American Commission on the Organization of American States. She was also a regional representative on the Commonwealth Working Group on Teacher Recruitment, led by the Commonwealth Secretariat. She also served on both the steering and advisory committees for the establishment of a virtual university for small states of the Commonwealth, led by the Commonwealth of Learning. She also represented Barbados on the Education Network and Regional Dialogue of the Inter-American Development Bank. Dr. Denny also served extensively with CXC as a local registrar for Barbados and as a member of the School Examination Committee. She was also chairman of the National Committee for CXC. While at the Caribbean Development Bank, Dr. Denny represented the bank on the Canada CARICOM Education for Employment Steering Committee. CARICOM's Council for Ministers for Human and Social Development, CARICOM's Working Group on Early Childhood Development, and the Transformation Task Force of the University of Guyana. Dr. Denny was also the founding president of the Barbados Association of Reading. She is currently serving as the chairman of the Education Reform Committee of the Ministry of Education, Technical, and Vocational Training. Ladies and gentlemen, comrades all, I bring to you Dr. Idamay Denny.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burrows. I want to offer my thanks to the Barbados Union of Teachers for asking me here this evening to sit as a part of this panel to have this discussion on education reform in the COVID-19 environment. Let me at the outset tell you how very hot I am. If you can see me, you can tell that I'm really hot. I don't know if where you're from, it is like we are having it in St. Philip, but I know John Goddard can agree with me that we can't open our windows and it is very hot here. I can't turn on the air conditioning either. So I am suffering through this presentation. But I am happy to be here with you, especially since teachers are one of the major stakeholders in education, and therefore whenever you're talking education reform, you have to bring teachers into the picture from very early stages. And as the chairman of the Education Reform Committee, I would say to you that just as we were about to begin our discussions with teachers last year, the COVID-19 pandemic struck, and we have not been able to have that discussion yet, but I assure you that there is nothing that is going to happen in the reform agenda unless we have had those consultations with teachers first. So if because of the situation in which we find ourselves this evening, I am not able to say all of the things that I would want to say relative to reform, we are going to have those discussions, probably, I hope, face to face, and therefore we have other opportunities to engage on the issue of reform. But I want to start my presentation this evening by looking at the rationale for education reform. Reform is required when you want to transform the structures of a system with the aim of continuously raising the quality of education in a country. So immediately you see that education reform is not a static procedure. It is something that is quite dynamic and that has to be happening all the time. Now, in 1997, the CARICOM heads of government set out a description of what they called the ideal Caribbean person. And part of the rationale for education reform across the region since then has been to ensure that our systems of education are turning out ideal Caribbean persons. Now, even before 1997 in Barbados, Mr. Lovell would have just made reference to the white paper on education reform, which was written in 1995. So even before the CARICOM heads of government came up with their description of the ideal Caribbean person in 1997, in Barbados, we gave a rationale for why we wanted to reform our system. We wanted to ensure that our young people would be lifelong learners, that they were capable of changing with and adapting to the demands of a new global society. And we wanted to ensure that they were equipped with skills to contribute to sustainable social and economic development locally, regionally, as well as globally. This was the philosophical underpinning of the last reform effort, which began with the development of that white paper in 1995 and continued with the development of Curriculum 2000 and all of the documents that would have been done in relation to the reform that we planned at that time. Now, with the recognition that it has been largely a quarter of a century, Rudy said 3 decades. He's absolutely right. It has been almost 3 decades since we have had that reform. And I told you just now that education is a dynamic process and reform has to be dynamic. So you would imagine that after almost 3 decades, we need to be looking at some measure of reform to address the existing issues in the system. And we do have a number of issues existing in the system right now. I'll share a few with you. We have programming that is out of sync with the needs of the economy. We have disengaged and indisciplined students. We have inequality and deficiencies within the system. There's also some persistent underperformance. There are low levels of certification. In other words, we have some children going to school and they would have gone to primary school for 8 years. They would have gone to secondary school for 5 years and they're coming out with no certification. We also have significant male attrition. When you look at the numbers that are promoted to fourth form, a lot of our male students are missing. There is also absence of standards and absence of accountability. There is also limited research and data to inform evidence-based decision-making. And we have an archaic regulatory framework. We are actually in 2021 now, and our education regulations and our Education Act would have been developed in the 1980s. So we have a lot of issues that require attention, and therefore the current government would have determined that the reform process needs to be re-engaged. And that is where we were when suddenly up came COVID-19. Now, there are a number of things that needed to be done, but with the onset of the pandemic, it became clear that there were a few things that we were going to have to put at the head of the line if we were going to benefit from the impact of the pandemic, and if we were going to put ourselves in a position to address these issues if we should have another pandemic or another disaster affecting us. And what are those things? The first thing, of course, is that we have to look at programming for diversification of the economy. I don't have to tell you what has happened with tourism. COVID-19 came and it clearly demonstrated to us that we cannot continue to put all of our eggs in the tourism basket. We have to diversify the economy if we are not to suffer the debilitating effects that we are now suffering because tourism has taken a significant hit from COVID-19. And where do you begin diversification of the economy? You begin it in the schools. You begin it in the curriculum by introducing programming that can lead to sustainable employment and the getting foreign exchange that we would normally get from tourism. Now, I'm not saying that we need to get rid of tourism. We need to let tourism be sort of the icing on the cake. But if we have another impact like COVID-19, we need to be able to draw on other skills and competencies and not to suffer as we have from the loss of the tourism, the dollars that are coming in from tourism. So that is the first thing that COVID-19 has said to us. We have to diversify the economy, and there's a symbiotic relationship with what is taught in schools with doing that. The second thing is when we had to shut down for COVID-19, when we had to shut the schools down, we had to go to online education, and that caught us literally with our pants down because there were teachers who did not have a clue what to do in terms of delivering online education. And that is not an indictment on teachers. You were going along doing what you normally did as a good teacher, and all of a sudden you had to teach in a modality that you were not familiar with. During the last term, as we have been engaged in observing instruction in the online environment, I have used this analogy with a lot of teachers. When I learned to drive 40 something years ago, you had to learn to drive on a manual car. And I got a license, but I really could not drive because every morning when I was driving down from Wildy to Deacon's Primary, I used to pray that when I got to Bridge Road, that the lights were on green so I didn't have to stop because I couldn't balance the clutch. And when I pressed the brakes, I was afraid that when the light turned green and I moved my foot off the brake, that I would roll back and hit somebody. And that is because I was not proficient. So I had really to learn to do those things in order to become competent. And over time, I became so competent at it that when I got to the stoplights at Bridge Road, I didn't care if the light was green or red because I could drive. So having to teach in an online environment is like that. It is something you have never done before, but all of a sudden it is something you have to be doing. You have to develop competence in it. And therefore, one of the things that COVID-19 has shown us is that we need to put measures in place to ensure that our teachers are competent to teach in this kind of environment, should we be so impacted again. But I don't want you to think that we should only have that training and that online environment just in case we have another pandemic. This is something that we need to incorporate into the fabric of our everyday teaching. We need to ensure that we get practice, and the only way you can get practice is if you continually do it. So therefore, we have to put measures in place so that our teachers can get that practice. But I don't only want to focus on the digital, on the online, because one of the things we recognized from last term is that there are some students who have not been to school for the entire term because they did not have the online means to access the classes. And I know people think, well, this is Barbados and everybody should be able to get online, but that is not really the case. You'd be surprised the number of people who don't have the means to get online. So rather than just doing digital, we have to focus on doing a whole electronic education framework so that we use all the media that the children may have access to, the digital, the TV, the radio, the telephone, the cell phone, so that we can make provision for all children to receive education if we are struck by the kind of pandemic that COVID-19 is, and our children cannot access the face-to-face education. The third thing that we need to fast track is that we need to restructure the system. If I may refer again to what went on during last term, where there's some children who did not access classes at all. We are asking those children, some of those children now, to write a common entrance exam, then they have missed a whole term of schooling. In fact, they've missed more than a whole term because they missed time in the last school year and they missed time in this school year. So many of them are far behind, and we know who those children are. We know the profile of those children. They are the most vulnerable. And therefore, we cannot have a situation where our most vulnerable get put further behind because they do not have the means to access education. So we need to look at restructuring the system so that we are making provision for those children all the time. And the last thing I will speak to at this point in time, and then I will give somebody else a chance to talk, is that one of the things that COVID-19 has taught us is that in our education reform, we are going to have to look to building the resilience of our children, both the physical as well as the mental resilience. As we hear the news about the COVID-19 deaths every day, we hear about people with underlying conditions. If we are to prevent or mitigate the underlying conditions taking lives, then we have to, from very early, make our children physically able to withstand these underlying conditions. It therefore means that we have to look at putting programs in place in school to help build their physical resilience. And of course, the mental resilience, we've seen examples of many children who are living in households where it is impossible to sit and pay attention to a lesson. There are psychosocial problems that many of them have been experiencing, and therefore we have to put measures in place to make sure that we help to strengthen the mental capacity of students so that if perchance something like COVID-19 happens again, they are in a position to withstand the effects of that pandemic or whatever crisis that happens to be. So I would say that there are some things, there are a number of things that broadly we need to do in the whole issue of education reform. And I guess when we have the question and answer session, we can talk to some of those. But I would say that these 4 things that I have singled out, those are things that we have to address very, very early in order to mitigate the ravages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denny. Some very powerful points. One that stood out for me is teachers did not have a clue of how to deal with delivering online education during COVID. My question to you in 30 seconds, Dr. Denny, are teachers the drivers of education reform or the Ministry of Education?
Well, the Ministry of Education has overall oversight and responsibility. And the Ministry of Education has to be in a position to lead. But teachers are a critical stakeholder, and the voice of teachers must be heard. And it must be heard very early.
Thank you very much. I now invite member of the Barbados Union of Teachers Occupational Safety and Health Committee, Sister Martinette King, to introduce our next presenter, Mr. Peter Wickham. Mrs. King, Ms. King.
Good afternoon to all. Mr. Peter W. Wickham is a political consultant and the principal director of Caribbean Development Research Services, CADRIS, the region's leading political research organization. This organization conducts political polls and research and has worked with all the major political parties within the OECS and across the Caribbean. In a more developmental framework, Mr. Wickham has served as a consultant to organizations such as the OAS, UNICEF, UN Women, and more recently, the CARICOM Secretariat. His work with UN Women forms part of a conversation on the issue of women in politics and leadership, which spans a decade and includes work done on behalf of the National Organization of Women, NOW, in Barbados, and several articles and other engagements in popular fora on this issue. In addition, he has written extensively on the politics of all Caribbean countries and participated in elections and electoral broadcasts since the mid-1990s. Previously, Mr. Wickham was a lecturer in political science and research methods at the University of the West Indies, Hayfield's Department of Government. During that time, he lectured courses in introductory and international politics, along with research methods. Furthermore, he was lead researcher for seminal research into domestic violence on behalf of the government of Barbados, and has also provided research support to the electoral reform process in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. Mr. Wickham is also somewhat of a media practitioner, making regular contributions to various popular media across the region, writing a weekly column in the Nation newspaper Barbados, and regularly hosting the famous calling program Down to Brass Tacks. Mr. Wickham, thank you for being here with us.
Mhm.
Before you come in, Mr. Wickham, give me a minute, please.
Mhm,
Let me meet
sure.
all
Mhm.
our presenters. I'm going to kindly ask that you mute your mics, please. We're getting some feedback. You can go now, Mr. Wickham. Thank you very much, sir.
Mhm. Okay, good. Good afternoon, and thanks for the invitation. I have the benefit of coming after Dr. Denny, which helps me to essentially have a couple of things to talk about. I have the opposite problem to Dr. Denny. She was too hot. I am in a reverse situation because I'm slightly further north. So the challenges and heat here, and actually I'm looking forward to being back in the warrants again. Some time ago, a person who was certainly much more wise than me said that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And I think that this is the position that I am coming from this afternoon as I speak to this whole issue of reform within the COVID environment. I think that certainly COVID has presented us with a crisis, and it's a terrible thing to waste a crisis. It's clear, certainly from listening to Dr. Denny, that there are some major issues that need to be addressed. And I think that far be it for us to say that COVID is a reason why we shouldn't. I think that COVID is a reason certainly why we should. The question of reform, the system, as I understand it, was not designed to be static. It will be in constant need of reform. Things change, people change, objectives change, the desires of the economy change, the interests of students change, teaching methods, all of these things are going to change from time to time. And as a result, reform is supposed to be something which is ongoing. And I think sadly within the teaching profession, that's not always the case. One of the things I am always struck by when I listen to certainly Dr. Denny's fairly extensive CV, and the fact that I'm familiar with many of the teachers and so on, many of them that graduated from University of the West Indies that would have done master's degrees and so on. We have an extremely well qualified teaching community, many of whom have, well, all of whom, in order to be appointed, have an advanced diploma or a master's in education. But there are some of among the teaching staff that have PhDs in education. The quantity of research that has been done at the Faculty of Education in UWA is quite significant, you know, and we have a panelist who represents that institution and will be able to speak to that more. So for me, the question is always, when people say that there needs to be more research done into education, it strikes me a bit odd, because I believe that our educational system is extremely well researched, heavily researched, and we have an extremely talented and well qualified teaching community that appears to know what they're doing and should be in a position to drive this change in the way that it needs to be moved. But we have two challenges. We have within the COVID environment, one of what I call the training aspect of education, which is where you teach people to do things on the basis of what they're good at or on the basis of what they're interested in. And then there's a testing and assessment where you say, well, let's see if people are able to do these things well. Within the context of COVID, it seems to me that the training and teaching has had to go online, and that's been the second challenge. And the whole question of testing is something also that needs to be discussed, and I certainly plan to discuss that shortly. The training methods have been forced to go online, have been forced to go online quickly. And what I think is unfortunate is that we were in a situation where persons who were in the teaching service could say that they're not familiar with the online modalities. Since 1990s, we have been moving in the direction of edutech. Many of the teachers have been issued with laptops. Certainly at home, they would use these facilities. And I don't think there's much of an excuse for anyone to be COVID unfriendly, sorry, to be technology unfriendly in this current environment, because it is something which children use. And I think that it is incumbent upon persons who are in the teaching community to be familiar with this type of online environment. I left the University of the West Indies in 2004. And in 2004, I could have delivered the class that I was teaching at that point in time electronically. I could have done it if I had to. Fortunately, I didn't have to. And I'm trying to struggle with the fact that in 2020, you actually have teachers who can say, you know, in all fairness, that they're unfamiliar with that environment. It's shocking. And I appreciate that teaching children, certainly at the primary and even to some extent the secondary level, is a lot more challenging than teaching adults at the university. But at the same time, if teaching children is something that you do, then you know you need to be able to do it. And I think that there's less of an excuse. I do agree that there are many of the students who have had challenges being able to respond to the environment. Many of them have not had tablets. Many of them have not had computers. Many have not had the environment within which to deal with that. But that's a completely different problem. That's a problem, a social problem that we're gonna have to tackle going down the road. But at the same time, I think that certainly the teaching community needs to have been in a position to deal with it. One of the things that was interesting in the United Kingdom was that they created an environment where persons who had to work online and could not babysit, so to speak, had support. And I just wondered how we were dealing with that in Barbados in the context of persons who were teaching and also being forced to take care of their own children at home. And that must have been a bit challenging, but that's something that will perhaps have to be looked at whenever the next pandemic comes around. So that's one problem, and that's one challenge which I think that we can look at. My greater concern, however, is this whole question of testing. And this is where my big problem comes in. And this is something that I have been ranting about for a long time, and I can't get it. I am baffled, I'm confused, and I have difficulty understanding when I listen to well-qualified members of the teaching community explained to me why in 2021, we're having a conversation about deferring a common entrance exam that needs to have been ended 10 years ago. And my position is simple. If we all accept that it's something that is unfair, it is inequitable, and it needs to go, then let's just end it now. When I hear teachers having conversations at the level of unions and whatnot, and essentially trying to find ways and means of deferring it and pushing it down because of COVID, and I'm just trying to understand what exactly is the problem. I listened to Dr. Denny, and I'm clear in my mind that certainly the types of reform that she's talking about is moving in that direction. So I'm saying we have people in the Ministry of Education that have the same kind of background, who are trained, who are well-researched, who are well-qualified, and in a position to say, well, let's deliver this product. There is absolutely no reason why we should be terrorizing students anytime this year with any 11+ exam. To do what? To test what? To evaluate what? We have 21 secondary schools that offer the same product, and we should be able to find a method of taking a student from one, putting them in the other, and essentially educating that person in the way they should be educated. The idea of forcing students into a competition now to get into one school versus the other is something that I struggle with trying to understand what is the logic and what is the benefit to community of that in the best of times, far less in a situation now where we're dealing with COVID. And you're right, the students that are going to suffer are the students at the bottom end of the economic situation, and they're going to suffer for no reason other than the fact that that is the reality of the life that they live. So then we go to the other end, and this is where we look at the situation with the Caribbean Examination Council. And the fact that the Caribbean Examination Council has essentially said they will maintain their approach to evaluation. They will have the exams in what they call a COVID-friendly environment, but they will have the exams nonetheless. And what they're saying is that if students want to defer, they're welcome to do so, but their exams will be coming off. I have my own reasons or my own ideas as to why the Caribbean Examination Council wants to forge ahead with doing exams, but at the same time, I think it is incumbent upon us as educators to say, look, this situation is one that requires a bit of reflection and thought. And the idea that a child could, by July this year, and certainly one of you can correct me if I'm wrong, be in a position to write a common entrance exam that assess a syllabus that they would have been delivered over a period of years fairly and compete against other students to see who can get scholarships and so on to go on to further education. It's not making sense. And I'm saying that if we are in a situation where we are telling ourselves we have to offer the exam, and if students want to defer, then they can defer, is that not in a way creating the same kind of advantage for the students who had the opportunity to study at home in nice rooms or nice offices or nice bedrooms in an environment where they could study properly, as distinct from others who were struggling, trying to compete at a dining room table, if indeed there was a dining room table, or sitting on the floor, in front of the television while people around are entertaining themselves in other ways? Are we not saying that one student is to have the advantage to take the exam this year while the other students go back? And I try to understand why it is that we can't get to a situation where we say to all students, we will be deferring examinations this year, because we don't believe that this year has been a year in which any student has been able to gain a whole lot and the system can be put forward. So those are my two main things that I believe that we need to look at. We need to look at how we are delivering the training component, and we have to look at this whole question of the testing component and whether we need to move it in a different direction. And I think that certainly at the secondary school entry level, there's a question as to whether or not we need to have a testing component period. And I think that that needs to be abandoned. And I think that COVID provides us the perfect opportunity to abandon it. And then the second point is this whole question of the Caribbean Examination Council and whether or not they should be doing exams this year. What is the reason that they absolutely have to do exams this year? And if it is not possible for them to approach the situation in a far different way under slightly different circumstances. There were some other points that I thought were useful. Programming out of sync This is something that I agree with entirely, that a lot of the program is out of sync. And let's start with the 11+ exam being programming out of sync. English, math, and comprehension. And that is the basis on which we assess the intelligence quotient of a child, right? That's out of sync. It's out of sync with reality, and it's out of sync with an environment in which so much more is going on at 11 or 10 years old in relation to the world that we live in. That is an adequate test of the child's intellectual or component, if indeed there's a need to test it in the first place. So definitely there's programming out of sync. And the second point that was made is related directly to that one. Students are disengaged. And the reasons the students are disengaged, quite simply, is because there's not a lot that is holding their interest in the classroom. We have problems with boys, especially, because sadly, the stuff that we are introducing, certainly initially between first and third form at secondary schools, is stuff that boys are probably less interested in. And we have this assumption that there are certain core subjects that children need to be able to grapple with. And I do believe that that makes sense to some extent, but I also think that we get a bit carried away in terms of trying to assume that these are the things that they need to know and understand, and that students who are not are students who are wayward or whatever. We will continue to have problems just with boys being disengaged and disinterested in the system if we are not rising to the challenge to give them something that they're interested in. So of course, the low levels of certification are going to be related in that. If I am in school studying something I'm not interested in, something I'm not talented in, I mean, what would you expect for us to not have the level of certification coming out? Because if you give me certification as certain standard subjects, and none of those subjects I have an interest in, then unfortunately I will come out with nothing. And perhaps we need to ask ourselves, maybe there is something else that we need to be certifying students in that is not available. So those are some of my very quick responses. And I think I'm peculiar on the panel in that I'm not an educator. I don't even know if I ever was for the time that I was teaching at the university. But I do feel that I have a sense of what the reality is on the ground. I've done research for the Barbados Union of Teachers already on major issues in educational reform. That is now an old document. But I do move around and hear the concerns of people in Barbados and certainly across the region regarding education. And I really do feel that we can do better. And I think it is incumbent upon us to do better and not to continue having conversations like this and then afterwards leaving them and saying, well, no, we go back to square one. So members, thank you for your interest. I tried not to stay longer than 10 minutes. And we're ready now to move on to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wickham. You spoke on some very key areas, training aspect of education and testing and assessment. And I'm sure that the audience will have some questions ready to line up for you as soon as you're finished. I'm now going to invite another member of the Occupational Health and Safety Committee, Brother Dwayne Walker, to introduce Mr. John Goddard.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, panelists. Mr. John Goddard, John Eustace Derrick Goddard, was educated at the St. Mark's Primary School. He later went on to MAPS College, the law school, and then Edison Teachers Training College. Following that, he attended the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, where he graduated with a BA honors in English with history. He also completed the Edison certificate in education. His work experience is wide and varied. He worked at the Barclays Bank before he worked also at the Ministry of Education. Later, he worked at the Printery before joining the teaching service in 1972. He taught English at the St. George Secondary School for 24 years and English and Communication Studies at Harrison College for 15 years. He was the senior teacher at Harrison College from 2001 to 2011. Mr. Goddard's achievement not only was in the classroom, as he was a beauty shop steward at St. George Secondary School and Harrison College for over 35 years. He retired in 2011. Mr. John Goddard is also a part-time tutor of English and Communication at Barbados Community College since 1997. His other activities include being the author of the following books: A Review of the Anglican Young People's Association, 1960 to 1979, and In God's Service, The Boy from College Savannah. Mr. John Goddard served on the board of management of the Princess Margaret Secondary School since 1997. He is a senior lay minister and synod representative of the St. Mark's Anglican Church. He's a member of the Anglican Bishops Pastoral Committee, 2000 to 2019, chairman of the Discssion Commission on Advocacy, Justice, and Social Responsibility. He's a former member of the Discssion Commission on Ministry, the member of the Commission on Social Justice and Human Rights of the Anglican Church in the province of the West Indies. He's a member of the St. Mark's Post Scholars Association. Mr. John Goddard was a former president of the Discssion Council of the Anglican Young People's Association and former member of the Government Industrial School Advisory Board. His distinguished career afforded him the following awards: the Pride of Barbados Award for Education presented by the Democratic Labour Party, the Barbados Service Star for Trade Unionism and the Teaching Service, National Independence Award, Independence Day 2019. He also received an award from the Barbados Union of Teachers for his contribution to education, and the union presented from the union, which was presented by the president on the 20th of October, in October 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. John Goddard.
John, Mr. Goddard, you're on mic. You have to unmute, please.
All right now?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Good. I want to express thanks to the Barbados Union of Teachers for inviting me to participate in this discussion in the presence of such distinguished company. If I could be easily intimidated, I would be intimidated by the presence of persons like my friend, Dr. Idamay Denny, Dr. Ian Marshall, and Peter Wickham. However, since I'm not easily intimidated, I think I can still offer my 2 cents worth. But coming after Dr. Denny and Peter Wickham, I don't know if I have a lot to say. But what I want to start by saying is this. I want to base my discussion on my presentation on reform on the following premises. The first is that the present system is producing too many failures. Secondly, I want to say that except that they have brain damage, my view is that all children can learn. It is a question of the rate at which they learn and the extent to which they can achieve. But my view is that they can learn. And therefore, our job as educators, the Ministry of Education and teachers, our job is to provide an environment in which every child can achieve his or her true potential. I support the arguments put forward by both Peter and Idamay on the rationale for change, for reform. And I agree that reform is a dynamic process. So even though there was an attempt at reform in 1995, some 30 years later, in fact, we should have carried out some reform earlier. I am a known critic of the common entrance examination. That is one of the things that Peter Wickham and I agree on. And I have come to this position because I have taught at one of the schools which is considered to be at the bottom of the scale, and of course, the elite of the elites. So I understand what impact the exam has on children. Now, in my view, this year, and this is where I agree with Peter, this year, this COVID year, in fact, since last year, to me, presented a wonderful opportunity to get rid of the common entrance exam. There are, what, 21 secondary schools in Barbados, or are there 20 now, that all provide an environment in which quality education can be delivered. Why do we need to continue with an examination which selects a group of children to send to schools that we consider to be the creme de la creme? And then we identify a number of students who we tell them that they pass, but we know that they do not pass. The marks are well below 30% and so on. And we send them to other schools. And then we expect them to follow the same program and to arrive at the CXC program at around the same time. And when they don't, and we are boasting about performance in schools, and when we are judging schools, we judge them on those grounds. We place the best, the students who have performed best at common entrance in one set of schools, place the ones who perform poorly in another set of schools, and then we pretend that we are passing judgment or trying to evaluate the various schools. So it seems to me that until we do something about the common entrance examination, we are going to continue to have a large number of children who are going to be disengaged, who are going to gravitate towards the blocks because they do not gain anything from education, the education that we offer. By the time a number of our students reach common entrance stage, and I think as a union, the teachers in the union know, by the time a lot of our students reach common entrance stage, they are already turned off. And you know, it is interesting, but even the students that we consider to be bright and have done well in the common entrance are sometimes, some of them are burnt out by the time they reach the Harrison colleges and the Lodge and the Queen's College and St. Michael's, you know. So that we place a lot of pressure on our children, and for what? We no longer have a situation where some schools have top quality teachers and others have teachers of lesser quality. We no longer have that. So why are we still trying to separate our children in that way? Now, this is my view. I think that at age 7 and 9, we ought to have diagnostic testing in the primary schools for the purpose of trying to identify weaknesses and trying to strengthen those. So that by age 11, the test that we're going to set is to determine readiness for secondary school, not to determine which school children are going to go to, but to determine readiness. And we should not, by age 11, still have a large number of children who cannot read and write, whose literacy and numeracy rates are so low. We shouldn't have that. That is an indictment on the system, not on the children, when we have that kind of situation. So at age 11, we transfer the children to the secondary school within easy access of them. I know people ask the question, what do we do with our brightest and best students? We need to have schools for our brightest and best. But there are some countries who just transfer, Finland, for example, simply transfer children to the schools within easy access of them. We behave as though every country must have a situation in which there are schools which cater to the so-called best students and the ones who cater to the rest. I do not subscribe to that. So let us do something about the common entrance examination. I want to also say this. We need to have special needs teachers right across the system to make sure that our children who suffer from autism, who experience various learning difficulties and disabilities are catered to. I do not think that we pay enough attention to children like that. We behave as though all children can learn at the same rate, and we don't spend enough time trying to diagnose issues which children have and working on those. We also need, Mr. Moderator, in our schools, social workers and psychologists to detect and correct behavioral problems early. When I, as a chairman of the Social Justice Commission of the Anglican Church, when we did research on violence among our young people, we discovered a number of things. One, of course, was the educational deficiencies of some of the children, but also poor parenting and poor home environment. We need to tackle that from school. I know Idamay, and I agree with her, talked about if we are going to diversify our economy, we have to start in the schools. If we are going to improve parenting, and if we are going to help our children to develop the values that we want them to have, that has to start from school and from primary school. So it is not too early to help children to understand what good parenting is from primary school. It is not too early to help our children to understand values from early. So values education must be done. Our home and family life program must include parenting, and we must take that seriously. Another concern I have, and you would have been told that I had a stint at the government industrial school. I cannot understand, and I couldn't understand when I served, why the government industrial school falls under the auspices of the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Attorney General's chambers. In my view, those children are still children in need of education. The Ministry of Education should be given responsibility for that institution, at least the greater responsibility for that institution, because those children should not be deprived of the opportunity to have a sound education. Having fallen afoul of the law should not be a reason why they must not be exposed to education. So I would want in any reform that the government and the role of the place the government industrial school is taken into consideration. In any case, the name of that institution needs to be changed to indicate that it's a reform school. And reform includes making sure that good quality education is provided for those children. So I want to pause here, and I will respond to any questions that are asked, and I will participate in the discussion later. But I want again to thank the Barbados Union of Teachers for having invited me to participate in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Goddard. You've delivered some very strong points. Too many failures in our schools. All children can learn. Reform is a dynamic process. But there's one question I want to leave in the air. Somebody can grab it as we go along. Would students from communities adjacent to some schools be accepted by society? You know, we have a lot of elite schools in Barbados. And many of our schools are what we consider to be, some people consider to be slums or ghettos. So in education reform, would that be accepted by the general populace? That question is being there. Somebody can grab it as we go along. I now invite our Secretary of Stewards, Sister Keisha Russell Graves, to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ian Marshall.
Thank you, Brother Lovell, Correction Chairman of Stewards. Good afternoon, colleagues. Dr. Ian Marshall is an educator with 28 years teaching experience. He has worked as a teacher trainer and leadership development expert from 2009 until the present. He is currently a lecturer in educational leadership at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. Dr. Marshall is also an educational consultant and travels throughout the Eastern Caribbean, facilitating training for current and prospective educational leaders. In addition, he works closely with principals and teacher trade unions in Barbados to deliver a number of professional and developmental workshops for teachers at the primary and secondary level. His research interests include, but are not limited to, principal and teacher leadership, effective schools, parental involvement, student academic achievement, and quality education. He is also a member of the TVET Monitoring System Technical Advisory Panel. He is married and is the father of 3 children. I now present to you Dr. Ian Alwyn Marshall.
All right, good evening, colleagues, and thank you, Keisha, for that introduction. Are you hearing me well?
Yes, Dr. Marshall.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, first of all, let me thank the executive for inviting me to this session. And I will go a bit wider in this discussion. And the first thing I want to establish is that if we're going to talk about reform, we have to contextualize reform. And reform is, for me, is contextualized in the whole notion of equitable education or the delivery of equity education. And why have I chosen that lens through which to view this whole issue of reform? I've chosen that lens because internationally, the main drivers of education would be, include rather, the whole notion of delivering equitable education to our students. And I want to underscore that for this reason, because within our system, we have some very serious elements that serve basically to undermine and to sacrifice what we are seeking to do in terms of equitable education. And the first one I want to point you to is the issue of structural inequalities. Other members of the panel alluded to this to some extent. And when I talk about structural inequalities, I'm talking about that system of elitism that exists, in other words, that was on which the education system was founded. And because it was founded on elitism, no matter what we try to do, if we don't address that framework that talks about structural inequalities, we will not be able to deal with these situations that confront us right now. So we can bring all the reforms that we want. If we place them within the context of a system that has inequalities, we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. I want to make that very clear. So any reform effort must be cognizant of the fact that there are structural inequalities in our system. And these inequalities stem from the very inception. In other words, in the nascent stages, these things were present in our system and they have not gone anywhere. All we have done is that we have simply changed modalities, but essentially at the core, we are still engaging in structurally inequitable practices that are continuing to destroy our people. The first point to make. The second point I want to make is as it relates to the phenomenon of good schools and bad schools. You have this phenomenon not only exists in Barbados. I want you to understand that this phenomenon of good schools and bad schools exists across the Caribbean and Latin America. In fact, every place where you do research, where there has been a history of imperialism and slavery or some form of it, it has deposited on those countries this whole notion of good schools and bad schools. Again, we cannot get away from that. So we can change the name, we can change the exam, we can change the time it is done, we can even abolish the exam. The point is the society is still structured in this notion of good schools and bad schools. So therefore, if you're going to do reform, I'm saying, look, deal with these fundamental issues first. That is phenomenon of good schools and bad schools. The next thing I want to talk about is the relationship between socioeconomic realities and academic achievement. In other words, what's the point I'm driving at here? When we look at our society, remember I told you earlier that it's about structural inequalities. One of those inequalities is the whole notion of economic disparities. So if I am capable and able, I am able to afford, give my son, my daughter, my children generally the best that they can have in terms of an education. But if I'm on the other end of the spectrum, what happens to me? I fall into that rut where no matter what I try to do, it becomes tremendously difficult to circumvent all those hurdles that are put in our way. And I'll just give you one example of that. And the example I'm going to point to is the whole notion of the digital divide. This was alluded to earlier by Dr. Denny, and I think Dr. Denny and Peter also mentioned this. But here's the point I'm making. We just came through COVID, and one of the things that came to the fore very glaringly is that there are inequalities, economic inequalities, having their impact now in terms of how well you can access your teaching and your learning. So there's another issue you have to deal with there in terms of that relationship. Again, so if I am at the lower end of the spectrum, what happens? I am going to be struggling to be able to even access education, even if you were to make it available to me. So the point I'm making is this. It is not only about universal access. If you open the door for me, but yet when I get into the building, I don't have the tools with which to access the learning, I am still no wiser. I hope you understand the point I'm making there. So this is what we're talking about in terms of the structural, the socio-economic inequalities. The next thing I want to talk about as well is the whole impact of these, I call them, these multinational agencies and the international organizations that provide us with funding. We need to understand something. When we are talking about reform, reform does not exist in a vacuum. So even if we try to create reforms, we still have this overarching influence of the international organizations who will come to us as small island states and tell us, well, this is the focus of the organizations right now. And if your program falls in sync with that, well, that is okay. But if your program does not fall in sync, what happens to your students? I'll give you an example. So we had the child-friendly school situation where we were told, okay, this is a new way of looking at child-friendly schools. However, we're already doing child-friendly. So therefore, what was the purpose of doing child-friendly school? They already have child-friendly philosophy built into my school. The point I'm making is this. If we are going to continue to access international funding, one of the things we need to do if we're talking about reform is that we need to have a situation where the persons who are the technocrats, the persons who are on the committees doing reform, they're supposed to be able to say, well, look, even if you bring your funding, we want to reserve the right to be able to shape or to use that funding in the way that best suits our needs. And those are the reasons, that is one of the reasons rather why when we receive funding, all that happens is that we go through what the literature calls policy churn. So we go from one policy to the next policy to the next policy. So if the money is being spent this year on early childhood, we will do early childhood reform. If the money is being spent on TechVot, we'll spend on TechVot. What is the point I'm making? If we are going to do reform, we have to conceptualize reform in terms like a 50-year cycle, not a political term or political terms, a 50-year cycle that says, okay, this is where we want to take the country 50 years down the line. So that even if I'm not even in government or in power at that time, the point is the program is so well structured that the next administration can continue the process of building capacity in our schools. That is what we need to do. That is the level that we must get to when we start talking about reform. Otherwise, I to think what will happen again, because again, we'll say, okay, we had reform. And I'll give you an example. We had, back in the day, we had Curriculum 2000. And in that reform, we were supposed to be doing all this technology, etc. Notice that in that very reform, what happened was that we were not even able to use all the money that was sent to us. We didn't use all the money, and some had to be sent back to the suppliers of that funding. What am I saying? If we had used that money when COVID struck, we would have been so well prepared to deal with the online environment. But what the point I'm making, that if you don't start to think about reform through that long, sustainable lens, then you are simply going to continue, as I say again, to spend more and more money on projects. And when the money ends, that is the end of the project, back to square one. The last thing I want to talk about now is what is of evaluation. Let me just drink some water here. Evaluation. Now, if we are going to do reform, the thing that we need to do is to have a serious think tank that looks at the issues that we would have addressed before, the things that would have been successful, the things that would have failed, and then on that basis, you then develop now a new reform agenda. Not where you are saying, okay, this sounds good, so let me do it. And I'll give you one example. And I'm not knocking anyone in this regard. We talked about having the idea of contractual arrangements for principals was mooted. Sounds very good on paper. But when you start talking about contractual arrangements for principals, how are you going to reconcile that with a system that is based on the tenure track system or security of tenure? How are you going to reconcile that? Are you going to have two parallel systems running? And then when you put principals in place through a tenure track system, what happens to those who are the incumbent leaders? What happens to them? And then in addition to that, how are you going to address the issue of evaluation of those very principles? Because understand what is happening. If you put me on a contractual arrangement, then you had better be sure that you provide me with all the tools, all the autonomy that I need to be able to run my school properly. Otherwise, after the 3-year contract has ended, you can't evaluate me and say, okay, I'm not renewing your contract because you failed to achieve the objectives. What I'm saying is this: it sounds good on paper, but we have to think it through, because there are a lot more elements to just moving from security of tenure, to a contractual arrangement. I admit that contractual arrangements will engender a higher level of accountability, but understand this: accountability cuts both ways. So if the principals are accountable, the Ministry of Education will also be held accountable as the employer, because you cannot put me into a job and don't provide me with the requisite tools, etc., to do my job effectively. Otherwise, it will be a farcical exercise. That is in terms of the issue of contractual arrangements. The other thing I want to address is the issue, another one that was mooted, is the whole issue of middle schools. Again, sounds good on paper, but contextually speaking, a middle school concept is a European or an American normed system. Well, in other words, is normed in the international system, basically. So when you bring that into the context of the Caribbean or in Barbados, to make it more granular, when you bring that into the context of Barbados, are we going to indigenize that system so that we have middle schools that do not just simply mirror what happens in the States or in Canada or in England? Because it does not mean that because it works over there, it will work here. We have to understand that middle schools will have the commensurate supports, etc., and the institutional strengthening that is required to be able to be successful. We cannot just be taking ideas from international arenas and say, oh, it worked over there, so it will work here. We have a different culture here. Because if you're going to the middle school concept, you have to do away with exams and just do like a GED, where you come to the system and you just have one general certificate at the end of your process. So these are all things that have been mooted that we want to. So my question is this: why are we, when we are talking about reform, are we really serious about reform? Or are we just saying, well, okay, this is a good time to do some reform? Understand the issue and understand the same issues that we are facing today, I can guarantee you, are the same issues that we will face 20, 40, 50 years down the line if we don't unpack and understand the forces that are at work in our education system to undermine what we are trying to do. So I don't have a problem with reform at all. I embrace reform, but I want to make it clear that reform cannot happen in a vacuum. In other words, you cannot put new wine into old wine skins. Those who, Mr. Goddard would know clearly what I'm talking about here, saying he's a man of the cloth, but you cannot put old wine into new wine, into old wine skins, because the wine will simply ferment and rupture the old wine skins. The same thing will happen here. We may not see the rupture immediately, but over time, you can guarantee that because the systems that we have foisted on people, and normally it is the case where we are foisting them on people, those systems will not be able to bear the fruits that we want them to bear. So I know I will be very controversial in my statement, but my point is this. I think that if we are serious about reform, then we must get to the root. In other words, dismantle the system and build it back. I don't want to say better, because that's an Americanism, but I'm saying dismantle the system and let us build the system based on what works for Barbadians. And the last point I want to address is this, and this is the case of reform again. We have a system now where we educate students and all the way to they get their scholarships, then they go overseas. And then we insist that having gone overseas, use the taxpayers' money, they must come back and work in Barbados. When you train a student in an area that does not even exist in our economy, when that person is forced to come back to Barbados, what is that person going to do? So in terms of even scholarships, we have to start thinking about how can we educate our people, start packaging education and selling it abroad. Because again, if the persons are able to be well educated, you can send them abroad and they can remit the foreign exchange the same way. In terms of having some arrangement where you can have arrangements where the persons travel overseas, remain overseas, but then they have an obligation to return to Barbados and to give back or to give back by virtue of sending back money in terms of taxes, whatever, however you want to design it. I'm just saying there's a need to change that, because before we were concerned about the brain drain situation. We no longer have that situation in Barbados. We have surplus educated people right now. So therefore, what you need to do is, when you're talking about reform, remember that reform is also extremely wide and extremely broad. And if you seek to tinker with the system, as opposed to dismantling it and building it back, then you are going to repeat the same mistakes. And I was there in 2000, that curriculum 2000 document was mooted, and it was presented by the persons in charge then. It's interesting that here is again, the same administration is also talking about reform again. My question is this: if we are saying that we have learned lessons, then recognize that the lesson from 2000 is that we have not done well with what we were supposed to do in that iteration of it. So then let us not repeat those mistakes. Let us look beyond what I call what's glossy and what is politically expedient, and let us build dismantle our system and build it back in a way that addresses these core issues rather than just seeking to gloss over it. Because as I said before, you can change the system, you can bring middle schools, you can bring end schools, first schools, you can call them whatever you like. If at the end of the day, the antecedent factors are still operating, you know success until the questions, which you assume will come fast and furious. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. You gave us a mouthful, belly full, and a bag of supermarket goods to take home with us. We touched on structural inequalities, elitism. Society is structured on good schools and bad schools. Will that ever change? You also believe, you say you believe that we should reserve the right to use funding from multinational agencies to perform the reform that we need. I agree with that. And ask, are we serious with reform? Now it is the turn of the audience to field questions to the moderators. Now I'm going to ask that you kindly raise your hand. After doing that, the two assistants will indicate, or I will indicate, who is at the top of the line. You will field your question to the moderator, and you will mute your mic while the moderator is responding. And if you need to respond after that, you will be given the opportunity to do so. So we now open the floor to any questions.
There's an Adrian too.
I'm kindly asking that you state your name. Just have to give your name before you begin to speak so we can properly address you.
No problem. Good evening to the panel. My name is Adrian Bascom. Can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Bascom, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Great. The gentleman just out there, as you have just kindly said, I like the part you use with the groceries. He has said quite a lot and a lot of food for thought, I find. And also, I want to commend Comrade John Goddard on what he has said as well. I'm in full agreement with the gentleman. Now, for far too long, I find that we have kind of have this discrimination against certain schools. And if we're going to do reform, okay, my question would be to both Mr. John Goddard and the same gentleman, if we're going to think about reform, before we're thinking about reform, will we be also including or making inclusive the mental fatigue that has on both the teachers and not only parents, the children themselves? That's my question.
Mr. Goddard or Dr. Marshall, any one of you all can go.
I'm trying to, what mental fatigue stemming from what? The mental fatigue you talked about with the teachers stemming from what in particular means?
Okay, the mental fatigue I'm talking about, basically speaking with, the children, like when we have the common entrance exam, and, a lot of parents and some certain teachers, not all, they put pressure on the children or make sure you work hard because we would like to see you in this school, we like to see you in that school. The normal thing. And the children, right, are in a mental position now that they have to try to come up to par with what both the parents want and what some of the teachers want. And if they don't come up to par, then they're gonna feel they're gonna place a mental fatigue, and then they're steep into depression. Now, if we're gonna talk about reform, okay, we want to reform this, we want to do this right, and as the gentleman was saying, we like to copycat too much. As this gentleman, that's what he was trying to say with this middle school. What will work for some other people may not work for the Caribbean, or may not work for us. And I agree with him. So that's what my question is to you. If we're going to do this, we have to consider all of those factors. And I don't think those factors are being considered enough. So that's basically my question to you and the gentleman. I really would like to hear more of you gentlemen on this. I like find it's a great concern, especially for the students and the teachers as well.
Yeah, Mr. Moderator, I am quite concerned about the kind of mental pressure placed not only on students, but teachers. As Ian pointed out, our society, our post-colonial societies somehow have this attitude towards education where the good schools and the so-called bad schools exist. And deeply ingrained in Barbadian society is this idea that all the secondary schools, and we even discriminate among those because there are about 3 or 4 of them that we consider to be the elite schools. And deeply ingrained in the society is that once my children can get into those schools, somehow they have it made already. The lives of our children are almost determined by that common entrance exam and which schools the children get into. That is how we think. And it's very difficult to erase that kind of mentality. In fact, I think you as teachers would know that very often the parents who are most supportive of retaining the common entrance exam are the parents whose children cannot get into the so-called elite schools. They are the ones who are most disadvantaged, yet they are the most serious defenders of the system. So much, and that has a lot to do with what we have actually instilled in our people. It's unfortunate. It is, it is a situation where unless we do something about that exam, it is going to continue. But we have to start somewhere. If we continue with the exam in the way it is, we are not going to change that mindset. And both teachers and students are going to go through great stress every year, trying to compete to see which schools which schools have the most passes for AC and QC, which schools are in the top 10, which schools are going to be read out on television for having performed best, and have poor teachers who didn't do as well, whose students didn't do as well, suffering themselves. So, and that is why, Mr. Moderator, even among the primary schools, you now have good primary schools and bad primary schools too, you know. I hope y'all are realizing that we now have schools which are the preferred schools. Let's call them the preferred schools at the primary level. And then the ones which are not preferred. And it has a lot to do with this perception that there are certain primary schools which are able to get a larger number of students into the elite grammar schools. But it is a problem deeply ingrained in societies like ours, as Ian pointed out, and it is extremely difficult to deal with. I would like to hear Ian comment on what kind of approach or approaches we can use to deal with that kind of mindset, because it is dangerous. It is not doing very much for our society, and we're seeing the results of it among a number of our young people who are disengaged and who are opting out of our society.
Thank you very much, John. Mr. Wickham, you have been a known advocate for the abolition of the common entrance. Would you want to speak to this topic at this time?
Yeah, always happy to. The aspect of it is, the aspect of it that I found most interesting from what was said was not so much that we're looking to move away from it, but the constant, on certainly a lot of the comments that we've been seeing, the suggestions that it needs to be replaced by something. And that had to be the focus of all the energy. What is it going to be replaced by? And it has to be replaced by something. That's my only concern. I think that in many ways that's an excuse. I feel that maybe the middle school is not necessarily the solution. I trust Ian's greater knowledge of these matters, but I also think that it's incumbent upon us to find a way of moving students from one system to the other. And if it comes down to one where we just have to say, look, you are in a school that is here, you go to one that's close by, you zone students, then so be it. But to me, the whole suggestion that the decision to change it or the decision to remove it has to revolve around an alternative placement mechanism. I think it's a trap that we fall into all the time, where we keep being told, that we can't do anything until we have a solution to that problem. And I think that we have to come to a stage where we say, look, we're just going to do it and just go right ahead.
All right.
Can I comment on this now, Moderator?
Of course, Dr. Marshall.
Yes, thank you. Again, to use the analogy, the forest can't see the forest for the trees. The fundamental point is that the issue is not about an examination. I can't underscore that enough, because irrespective of the methodology that you use to transition students, even if you were to use 0 exams, even if you were to have automatic transfer, even if you were to say, well, okay, wherever you live, you will go to school there, I can guarantee you that there will be people who will change their addresses and their locations just to get their children in what they consider to be the preferred schools. Because as I said, the mentality is endemic. And the point I'm making is that, as I said before, is that the way how you deal with that is that wherever you see instances of elitism emerging, you have what is called a systematic approach to neutralizing that elitism. So the international community has recognized that, and what they are seeking to do now is that they are looking to, wherever they see elitism emerging or inequities emerging, they are charged with the responsibility to put systems in place to neutralize those inequalities. That is what they're looking at now in terms of quality education. So they're moving away now from what we call universal access, because they recognize that universal access alone does not guarantee equitable education. So they're saying, you know what, we have given you access, yes, but we need to go the stage further and to ensure that when they get into any school, irrespective of where the school is located, all the resources, all the supports that are necessary to ensure effective delivery of instruction, all those things must be in place. And it will not happen overnight, as I said, but it is a recognition first that these inequalities exist, and then putting systems in place to systematically dismantle the system that is generating or spawning these inequalities. But again, I must underscore the point that it takes a person with great intestinal fortitude, both in terms of policy and practice, to be able to go down that line. Because what you're essentially doing, as you seek to dismantle these inequities, is that you're really undermining the very base of the power brokers in the society, because the power brokers or the gatekeepers are benefiting from this system. So therefore, they have no vested interest in dismantling it. But unfortunately, sometimes these are the very people who are in policy positions to impact change. So you can see the difficulty that we will have. Unless you get people in these positions who are prepared to not only rock the boat, but capsize the boat, it will not happen. But there's a systematic way of doing it. You identify the inequity, you identify the prejudices that exist, and you put systems in place to address them, and not rely on political expediency, as I said before, because these questions, the issues can be resolved. It is whether we have the political will or the political skill to do so, or are we prepared to even sacrifice your very position as a leader in the interest of doing what is in the best interest of our citizens? That's what it comes down to, Am I prepared to sacrifice my political career, by doing something that I know is in the best interest of the children or the society, even though persons will give me, I may actually lose my position as a leader because I did that. But in the long term, you will see the benefits of doing so. We are not of that ilk necessarily. It takes a different mindset and a different thinking to be able to advance that type of policy. So as I said, it can be done, but it takes political.
But Ian,
Can I weigh in on this, please?
Mr. Goddard, would you give way to Dr. Denny?
Of course. Okay. I give it, ladies.
Fabian Lewis, you're next. Yes, give us some time. Yes, Dr. Denny.
Interestingly, I attended a few meetings where the whole question of whether the common entrance should be done this year has arisen. And you know what struck me? It struck me that teachers and principals, their main focus was my children are ready, even though they were presented with evidence that there were children who were definitely not ready because they hadn't seen any instruction for the term. So which children were they talking about? Certainly not the poor and vulnerable ones. So what I would like to say is that as teachers, we must question ourselves first. Are we helping to perpetuate this system? Because when we walk about and brag about how many children we got for X or Y school, without thinking of the ones who did not come anywhere near that because we went along and left them, because they were not going to bring us that kind of glory that we were looking for. We are part of the problem. So I want teachers to give an honest look at this and see if you are part of the problem. I agree with all three gentlemen. The common entrance has outlived its usefulness. The common entrance was there when we did not have enough places at the secondary level, and it was being used to see which children should move on. We have been in a place for the longest time where we have more than enough places at the secondary level to accommodate all of our children. So the common entrance has outlived its usefulness. The other thing is too that principals and teachers need to sell their schools. You know, there's good work going on in some schools here that people call bad schools. And then I said to the principal, but why you don't let the public know this? They want to go to the public and say, my school is doing this or my school is doing that. I was talking to a principal when we were looking at introducing the coding and robotics program. And there were some children in this particular school who were doing things that amounted to creating robots to do what they wanted done. How many people in Barbados know that? So when you are at a school, you have a responsibility to sell that school too. I was talking to principals about the cohort in which we would pilot the coding and robotics program in their schools. And I looked at the numbers that would have been assigned to those schools from the common entrance. You know, there were certain schools that had less than half of the children that I thought were in those cohorts. You had a secondary school that took in 53 children in a cohort, where usually the number would be nearly 200. Now, I agree that the persons with oversight of the system have to put the foot down and make sure certain things happen. But I think the schools have a responsibility to themselves and to the children who are in them to sell themselves. Let people out there know what you are good for. And some of the schools that people will tell you are bad schools, they may be the best schools. They add in the most value. And if we look at schools in terms of the value that is added, we would get the shock of our lives, because some of the schools which we think are the best schools are now adding a lot of value. The children doing what they're expected to do. So therefore, I think that we as teachers, and I counted myself in that, we as teachers need to look and see if we are contributing to the problem. Yes, I know that when we take decisions to move on, that there's going to be a whole lot of talk. Yes, there are people who are invested in seeing the system move on, but we got to make sure that we are not among those. If not, nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to change.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denny.
Yeah, I was saying, yes, Mr. Moderator, I want to support what Idamay has said. Teachers we need to stop looking for bragging rights and see ourselves as being responsible for the education of all our children, whether they can score 95 or 45. And we need, as she said, to add value to these children. And in response to something which was said by Dr. Marshall, I do not think that the problem is inequality of resources. I think it has to do with prejudices, ingrained prejudices in the society. I do not think that, let us say, Ellerslie has any fewer resources than Harrison College. I really don't. I think it has to do with how the society perceives AHC as opposed to how they perceive Ellerslie. That is what the problem is. We must stop believing or fooling ourselves that certain schools have resources which the others don't have. I do not buy that. I have worked as a board member at a secondary school, and I do not see it having any fewer resources, teaching or otherwise, than the school from which I retired. I really don't. So I think it has a lot to do with the prejudices that we have. And I agree with Idamay that teachers need to make sure that we are not part of the set of obstacles to change. We must not behave as though this society cannot go forward if we do not have a common entrance exam that we can boast about every year. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I was once, before I left St. George Secondary, I was invited as a guest speaker at a primary school in Barbados. And the principal was delivering the principal's report. And one of the things, and interestingly, the lady who was presenting the awards was a past student of St. George Secondary School. You know what the principal said in his report? He gave out the school to which his children were going. And then he said, thank God we had only one for St. George Secondary. Now, here was the guest speaker teaching who was teaching at that school, and a student presented the awards who was educated at school. But he was so caught up with his boasting about the performance of the school that he didn't show any sensitivity to those facts. So we have to watch it. We teachers have to watch it, that we don't contribute to the problem. All right. If there's going to be change, we have to be part of that change and stop telling people that the problem is that some schools don't have enough resources. I don't think that is the problem.
Thank you, Brother Goddard. I want to support the point. I usually tell people that I work at the best school in Barbados, and when they utter the name Grant Adams, they are shocked. But I do work at the best school in Barbados. We're now going to open to Mr. Fabian Lewis. What's your question, sir?
Good evening to everyone, distinguished panel, as well as all comrades of education. I am Fabian Lewis, a teacher of 19 years practice from today. And I join you this evening to offer a little insight. Now, I'm going to restrict myself to just the conceptual level of things, because the upcoming consultations, we can go into the details or the nitty-gritty. So here we are looking mainly at a conceptual framework in which we can implement reform, okay? And in dealing with these things, we have to think long-term, type of like the Asian philosophy. I heard Dr. Marshall refer to at least 50 years, but I'm thinking about, let's say 100 years, because we have to apply the process of gradualism in order to achieve different benchmarks from time to time, let's say every 10, 20, 30 years or so. This cannot be, as we normally do things, based on a political structure in terms of the time frame of elections and which party comes in and which party goes out. There has to be something that is fundamental, such as we're looking at social engineering. So, such as to address identity. We have to look at the whole idea of leadership for every single one. Principals, teachers, as well as even the politicians. Now, in looking at such a framework, we have to ensure we looked at productivity across the board. Productivity is very vital and important. It addresses the whole idea of motivation, stress factors, looks at dieting, exercise, all of these things we will have to put in a broad framework in which to address it. So we'll be looking at the philosophical as well as the psychological underpinnings of such a framework that will enable us to have a sustainable program for decades to come, and not just approach it willy-nilly here. Not, I shouldn't use that term, but approach it in less than a long-term perspective, such that we can have benchmarks that we can tick off as we go along decade, every 5 years, every decade going down the line. So we need to think, and the best country that I can think of in terms of a framework. And I'm basing this on when the Right Honorable Errol Walton Barrow wanted to find an economic model for Barbados. He looked at the Singapore model. Now, Singapore is also a leading nation in education, let's say for more than a decade. So I would just humbly suggesting that we can look at Singapore in terms of a framework or a model that we can start to focus and zero in and narrow down. Now, I know we have our own cultural inadequacies and stuff like that, but within a framework, we will have the guideposts that can keep us structured in a way that we will know when we are either achieving the targets or the benchmarks, and then we can always adjust or readjust accordingly. Now, one thing that I did not hear mentioned so much this evening was the whole buy-in from the implementers, which would be the teachers. Now, this is just my anecdotal records over the last 19 years I have been with you. Most of the time we have these types of discussions or meetings and workshops and stuff like that. There is not the level of participation from the practitioners, as I will call us. Sometimes we have people who are organizing things, but then let's face it, all teachers must then come and implement these things. So we need to have a greater level of participation from all teachers, every single one. Otherwise we will just gonna have this whole exercise of putting things in place similar to EduTech 2000, and then somewhere along the line, we forget about it. I remember in 2011, we also had the whole idea of licensing the teachers, setting up a national council for teachers and stuff like that. Now, I might be speaking on the correction, but there is no mass gathering of teachers on this island. I remember speaking about that some time ago at the Barbados Workers Union headquarters. We need to have a mass gathering of teachers, at least biannually or something like that, so we can exchange ideas, look for best practices, so we can keep this process going. And I will pause there for now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewis. I'm now going to ask Maria Ben. I think that Maria Ben is next.
Good evening to the presenters and my fellow panelists. I am, like all the speakers for this evening, not in favor of 11+. I'm a parent. I was very much a part of the system, but I think it has outlived its usefulness. To, for me, strengthen the point made by Dr. Marshall a little earlier regarding the elitism that exists with respect to 11+. Every year, well, except last year because of the pandemic, we are proud to read out the names of persons who've been awarded scholarships from the Barbados government. And I've always wondered, why don't we, after all these years, we've included the Barbados Community College, and every secondary school on island qualifies once they meet the criteria that's set. We have a Samuel Jackman Prescott, formerly the Samuel Jackman Prescott Polytechnic. It's the Samuel Jackman Prescott Institute of Technology now, I think. And we have students there who are doing really good work. And why don't they qualify to receive a scholarship? Most of them are studying in the technical vocational areas that make a whole lot of money. And this is something that I find is not taught to children. Children are drilled into believing that academics are the ones who make a lot of money. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So we don't encourage children who show an interest in that regard. And by extension, they're not awarded if they choose to go in that direction. I think it is high time that we move away from awarding only academic excellence, and we see it fit to award those students whose intelligence has some academia, but their interest is in the technical vocational area, because I believe that all children are academics in some form, even if they choose to work in the technical vocational area, because they all need the basics of at least arithmetic and English. And so they cannot be non-academic and function in a technical world. They need to rely on those skills. My question to the panel is, though I still have someone in the system, but who's not yet at the CXC stage, I am extremely concerned about what is happening to our students regionally with regard to exams this year. I'm of the opinion if England saw a workaround, a fix, whatever you choose to call it, to mitigate the fallout from COVID, certainly CARICOM as a drop in the bucket of nations compared with New Zealand, Australia, Wales, all the groups that Cambridge would cater to exam-wise, then we must be able to find a fix for it here. I want to know if, as a panel, your thoughts as to what leverage parents have with regard to agitating on behalf of the students to have exams not done this year, have them canceled because of all of the anomalies at play. We had COVID, which was in and of itself an inconvenience. On top of all of that, now certainly St. Vincent, St. Lucia, and Barbados are now affected because of the volcano. So I'd like to know your thoughts regarding that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Let me just say that many people believe that technical and vocational education is aside from academics, but I don't know if most people realize that the brain guides the hand. Essentially, when we are saying that persons are not intelligent, that is a myth. Those persons who are technically and vocationally inclined are very much, in truth and fact, academic, but they're just academic in a different way. I see Mr. Wickham has his hand in the air. I'm going to go to him first. Peter?
Yeah. Okay, no, I'm conscious of the time and the fact that, we've been talking a lot, so I'm going to just be very brief and to say that I support Maria's ideas entirely. The second point she made about the CXC, I really think that the question as to what should happen, we are not in a situation where we are in any colonial backwater and we need to be standing on the side of the roads protesting and saying, we want this and we want that. CXC belongs to us. It is something that we control, and I do not believe that the heads of governments are completely powerless in this regard. This whole idea that CXC has developed a personality of its own, where it has, because it has a registrar, that person has powers which are immune from any kind of incursion by the CARICOM Secretariat or by CARICOM leaders is something that I do not accept. And I think that CXC needs to be told what to do. And in this situation, it's very clear that they need to be told that, examinations this year are not a good idea, not under these current conditions. But I'll let the other experts respond to that. Excellent point about the whole scholarship program. For a long time, I've been advocating that the current scholarship arrangement is completely outlived its usefulness, like the 11+ exam, and it should be discontinued, and scrapped. If a student does well in physics, chemistry, and whatever, that student should get a book. And congratulations. The reality is that most of the students who do well in those traditional areas invariably will qualify for scholarships from universities, or alternatively, in most instances, the parents have money anyhow. But my thing is, if my child's skill is dance, that is where their talent lies. Why should my child not be able to qualify for a scholarship in dance? I think that the whole national development concept makes a lot more sense. I think we should be putting money and giving scholarships to people who are studying something that could help to develop Barbados. The current arrangement now, they will go and study rocket science, or alternatively, they will study to be doctors or study to be lawyers. So when a person takes a scholarship, they go off to Manchester, they study to become a doctor, they become a medical doctor. And I think to myself, we are already producing 25 a year here. What sense does that make for us? That's not something that we need. We do, however, need people in areas of creativity. We also need people in areas of design and computer expertise and whatnot. And I think that that's really where government's money should be put in. I don't have a problem with a person who does well in the traditional areas. But my thing is, if you do well in those areas, you can make a good living for yourself, fine. But the fact is that if the state is funding it, I think the state should put its money into something that has a developmental return and not to be sending students off to Oxford and Cambridge to study astrophysics, which can never have an impact on Barbados' future.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm going to crave the indulgence of the audience. We have reached 6 o'clock, but I know we have at least 4 or 5 persons who would wish to contribute. So I'm asking that you give us another 30 minutes. Cyprian and then Victoria Castella. Cyprian first.
Mr. Lovell, before you go to Cyprian, if I could provide an answer to Maria's points. Both
No problem.
of them were very good points. I think that in order for people to take certain areas seriously, you have to show, the system has to show that it values these areas. And the way we show that we value areas is by awarding scholarships. Therefore, it means that if people are going to take technical and vocational education seriously, then we have to begin offering scholarships in those areas. And I think you will be very pleased to learn that that is the direction in which the government proposes to go. There are skills and competencies that need to be valued in the same way that we value academic success. And when that is done, parents will get serious about pushing their children in these areas because they know that they are going to be rewarded. The other point you made relative to CXC, I don't know if you are aware, but CARICOM would have met, the COSA, the Council of Human and Social Development Education, would have met and would have agreed on the proposals put forward by CXC relative to the offering of examinations this year. Now, I have my own personal opinion as to whether the decisions that were taken represent the interests of all children. But I think teachers and parents need to say to the government, this is how we feel. And as Peter said, CXC don't support themselves, we support CXC. So it is a matter of where CXC is taking the lead, it is the carrot going before the horse. So therefore, teachers and parents need to send a strong message that if this is not the best thing for the children, then we should not be doing it. But as I said, CARICOM has already met and they have ratified a decision to go with the recommendations that CXC has put forward relative to the writing of the exams this year.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Denny. Cyprian Latuch.
Good afternoon to you, panel. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, I can try to make my comments short. Y'all are really talking about reform. And that's my real opinion. Y'all are talking more or less about maintaining a status quo. Okay? Because we have this conversation about getting rid of a common entrance exam year in, year out. We don't do it, and we don't ask the question, why don't we do it? And the answer simply is because we like it. So we are trying to find methods of not doing what actually has to be done. This is our challenge. And we don't have the conversations that are necessary to show that, listen, we are thinking not far beyond the common entrance exam, we're thinking about education. Let me ask you all one question. How come I have not heard one suggestion from here, from anybody else, or from any place, any other conversation I've heard about education in Barbados, about building a school which is better than Harrison College? Call it King's College, build it in St. Lucie, and have an exam that sends all the best children to King's College as opposed to Harrison College. So therefore you can get a top tier of children going to King's College, and then a second tier of children that wouldn't have gotten into Harrison College before going to Harrison College. Not once do I hear that recommendation or conversation, because it is about maintaining Harrison College as the premier or elite school. The next thing, let's talk about what is really happening right in front of our eyes right now. When we talk about inequality, and especially in education, people whose children, quote unquote, fail the common entrance, okay, do not pass for Harrison College or Queen's College, where do they go? They go to private schools because the parents take those children. They have the resources. They take those children and they put them in private school. So therefore, what we are seeing right now is a return to the inequalities in education, which existed, and that was why education was made free in the first place, to stop those inequalities. And we are seeing a return to that. Okay, but nobody is dealing with that. Nobody has even mentioned private schools. And what ends up happening is that you have parents who are the most interested in their children's education and who have the resources and the time and the dedication to give to education. They end up giving them into a private school. So therefore you have situations where parents aren't going to turn up at a public school meeting, but when a private school PTA is called, they're there. And you all aren't dealing with that. The next thing in terms of technology, right? You are not incorporating the aspect of technology and the advances in technology that have occurred over the last few years, or over the last many years. Because the whole principle of education before was that you had limited resources, so therefore, and limited opportunities, so therefore limited spaces. So therefore you had to compete for the best spaces for people to be able to go to the best facilities. They had to then compete. We now have technology that provides, with the internet, that can provide education to everybody. Everybody can deliver education at any time to everybody. Why are we not incorporating that? COVID has forced us to go online. And all you hear is everybody quarreling about, oh, we can't do it online, but we know all sorts of nonsense. As opposed to saying, how can we best incorporate this here and use the advances in technology now that allow us then to get the education out to everybody? So people, because the most important thing is the children. And again, you're not dealing with that. You're not dealing with what is most important for teachers, for everybody else except the children. Because the recognition has to be that children develop at their own pace. They develop differently as well. And nobody is at age 10, nobody can necessarily know everything that they can do or what they should do for the rest of their life or what they want to do for the rest of their lives. So what education needs to focus on after they have been given the tools to know how to communicate is to give them the access and the opportunity to experience any and every aspect of life that they have the opportunity to do. And then they can establish those interests. And the reason I say that is because, again, the things which we're not looking at in Barbados and asking ourselves, but why is the US so successful? You know one of the reasons why? Because they have spaces that show children what life is really about, like museums. They have libraries. They have sports stadium. Okay, so a child can go out after school, outside the school, and it doesn't matter which school to go to. They can go and experience an environment like what you call it, when you go and look at like stars and stuff like that there. Go to a planetarium. And they can hear lectures and see lectures on the same level as any other child in any other school. So therefore, it doesn't matter what school the child goes to. These are the things in which, if you have limited resources in the country, that you need then to focus and put your resources on to then expand and allow everybody in the country equal access to them. Look at how long our stadium has been derelict. How much attention we paid to it? This is madness. I went in the public library a couple of years ago, and it was appalled at what I saw and what I heard people more than anything else. I'm used to on Saturdays after school, Saturdays, when it was at Arts and College, I would go to the library in Bridgetown. And you had to walk when you went in there, you had to be quiet. And when you reference everything, it was quiet. And I could access all the books and I could learn everything I wanted or whatever. I went to the library, this library here, this 2-bit foolishness a couple of years ago. And I hear children screaming at the top of the line at the voices, screaming and running about the place and the conducting classes. And this is what we call a library. And this is how we look to provide education for people. Are we talking about change, educational reform? We do not understand this is not just about a common entrance exam. I have no problem with getting rid of a common entrance exam. But I know that the only reason why the conversation is focused on getting rid of a common entrance exam is because that is the lowest hanging fruit to maintain the same status quo, as in there's some people that can still end up going to pump gas, and then there's some people whose their families can afford it are going to become doctors or lawyers or what have you. That is my problem when I hear these conversations being driven this way.
Thank you very much, Mr. Latouche. Any of the panelists want to respond before we go to our next?
Yes, I wanted to ask Mr. Latouche. I heard him, first of all, talk about why don't we talk about setting up a college to rival Harrison College. I don't really need any college to rival anything else. What we want is to make sure that our children, without any discrimination against them, get into schools which are going to provide quality education for them.
But this is not about rivaling Harrison College. You are getting what I'm telling you. Listen, a couple of weeks ago. Sorry, I'm sorry. I was going to respond.
Allow Mr. Goddard to speak, please.
Okay. I heard you say. You asked the question, why haven't we focused on setting up an institution that is better than Harrison College? That I use the word rival, but it's better than Harrison College and so on. I don't know if we're talking about any better than anything else. We want all of our schools to provide quality education. That's what we're there. And you talk about not focusing attention on the children. I think that most of what we are saying this evening is focus on providing more and better opportunities for the children. Whatever I think people have offered, whatever suggestions that have been offered, I think have been offered to provide better education for them. And the third thing, you talk about private school. In a democratic society, we cannot prevent people who have money from sending their children to private schools. But government taxpayer money must not pay for it. If you are not satisfied with the status quo that we have in our educational system, if you think that we're not providing special elite schools for your children, and you have the money to send them to private schools, fine, go ahead. I don't think we should even attempt to stop them. That is not our concern. What we must make sure is that the schools which government run are properly run and provide high quality education. That's what we must make sure. So that the child of the maid or the child of the carpenter has an equal opportunity to get a good education in the government system. That is what we need to make sure we have. And I agree with you. I agree with you about the quality deterioration of our library system and so on. And if we need to spend resources on providing opportunities for our children to be able to experience life outside of the school, outside of the classroom. So I can't fault you on that particular point, but I have an issue with the first three.
I'm sorry. Right. I will respond quickly.
You have 30 seconds to respond.
No problem. Again, is the answers that you have given me, or what you've said, is again a reflection of exactly what I said. There is this thing, the first thing you start with, well, you don't know if we have any need to create a school which is better than Harrison College. Why not? What is wrong with asking that question? No, just a second. No, hold on, just a second. Just give me a second, okay? I am asking, what is wrong with asking the question? What is wrong with making the proposal? What is wrong with contemplating it? If I want a school that is better than Harrison College, I'm trying to tell you, it isn't a matter of me caring about Harrison College. I am caring about the child. We talk about wanting to give equal access and opportunity to all the children. Again, you're forgetting the children in public schools are competing against the children in private schools. So therefore, when you tell me you're only concerned about what we do in government and you can't stop people from sending the children to private school, I never said you can stop people from sending children from private school. I'm trying to tell you, to get you to recognize that you are also competing against children, not just in Barbados, but all over the world who have that thing, who have that challenge, who have that benefit.
If I may, just very quickly, Mr. Latouche.
Thank you very much, Mr. Latouche. Dr. Denny?
Mr. Latouche, I think you may have come in a little after the beginning because I did make a lot of references to those vulnerable students. So I think you may need to get the whole recording and go through it and see that some of those answers were given. But there's something you talked about that was a good point. You talk about the experiences, firsthand experiences that our children do not get. I was invited by a principal, a primary school principal, to his school to see a virtual reality lab that he has set up. And he has a situation there where you have these disgusting little boys who give all this trouble, but who want to be in that virtual reality lab at lunchtime so that they can put on their goggles or whatever you call them and go ride elephants and all of those things. There was one little boy who, while I was there observing, managed to get himself up on an elephant. And I can't, in all honesty, tell you how he got it done. But all of the children were so taken with it that when it was time for those children to leave, they didn't want to leave. That is the kind of thing we want. We want these little boys, especially, to be engaged, but we also want them get the vicarious experiences that they are never going to get in Barbados when they come from a certain social class. So you are absolutely right in that. And that is one of the things that I say to the ministry. You need to make sure that all of these schools are equipped with virtual reality labs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denny. We're now going to go to Victoria Castello. Marshall.
Okay, good evening, colleagues. I am enjoying this session and I congratulate the BUT. This is a very good thing and it's always good that teachers should have a forum for discussion. My question is for Dr. Marshall. But before I ask the question, I want to be able to say that I do agree with Dr. Denny that all schools should have their own niche. At this time, until we have everything else sorted out, it is very important that we work with what we have and be able to say, well, there's excellence in this specific area. I also agree with you, Mr. Lovell, that and for the longest time, Dr. Jules was trying to dispel this myth that there's no academia in tech and for areas. There are still a lot of teachers who believe that. My question for Dr. Marshall is, I'm not sure if you answered it, if it was asked before, what is your suggestion for the type of reform which will incorporate our culture, request accountability at all levels while considering structural inequalities, as well as how do you engage students who have been disengaged for so long? That's it for me. Thank you.
Dr. Marshall, we can't hear you. You have to unmute, sir. Dr. Marshall, your mic is muted.
Yes, I just muted it. I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Castello Marshall. I think we recognize our voice from back in the day. Those are very good questions. And they're all interrelated. What I will say as it relates to you asked about what will we do with those students who are disengaged, and because we are talking about, we can look at the whole notion of second chance education, that concept where you seek to reach those children on a different level. Because if the problem with the reform process is that it does not ever result in immediate benefits for those who are going through the process, because reform in itself is a process. So therefore, while we might start the process now, and we are talking about the immediacy of the situation, those students who are immediately disinterested may not be addressed in that immediate way. It will be for a time down the road. The immediacy will have to be addressed in terms of restructuring the program to deal with their specific needs. But I don't want to suggest that either, because that might only be a piecemeal measure. The wider and more important thing in terms of educational reform is, you talked about the role of teachers, etc. And I'm saying that if we are going to reform our system will be reformed in a way that considers the teachers at the core as well as the students at the core. So therefore, you're not talking about a one-sided reformation. You're talking about a reform that takes into consideration all the stakeholders, and you seek to forge a program for that. My saying with the reform is that I would, first of all, look at the needs of the system, all the problems that we are currently experiencing, and then devise a system that will address those underlying needs, as opposed to a system that will address what they call the topical issues. That is the only way you can get a reform process that will have sustainability. Because if I don't operate on that level, I am going to just be addressing an immediate concern, as I said, but not the long-term issue. So I may address the need for those who are now in 4th form or 5th form, but I don't want that. I want the system to be reformed in such a way that the persons 25 years, 50 years down the line are also benefiting from that reform initiative. So that is the only way that we can deal with it. Unfortunately, the reform, as I said again, is not about immediacy. It is about long-term impact. So you can devise a stopgap measure, even as it relates to the combination, as I said, that is not even the real issue, because the combination is just a testing mechanism. And all it does is it shows us that our systems are failing our children. So therefore, address these issues, the reasons why the systems are failing our children, and then we can come up with something other than combinations. It can be anything you decide. All I'm saying is that if it does not address those issues that spawn the problems in the first place, you will have a new name, new nomenclature, but at the same time, the problems will continue to be developed, so to speak. So I am sorry that I can't give you an immediate solution. My solution would be sustainability in terms of 40 or 50 years down the line. I'll give you one example of how that works. There was this guy that he worked in Japan or China. I think it was either Japan or China. And what his father was in charge of a business, a lingerie business. And he said that the government, the company, the father had a 50-year plan for the company to be one of the top suppliers of quality lingerie materials, goods, and so on for females. And the father did not achieve the objective, but his son was the one, he laid the foundation, but it was his son who was able to achieve that 50-year objective. The point I'm making here is this: you will start at this level, but recognize that the results or the value will be seen way down the line. So we have to I suppose, disabuse our minds of the notion that it should happen, that we should have immediate results, because that is really one of the difficult of saying you have to start somewhere. And when we get into that more, that you have to start somewhere, we don't consider the entire the whole system and how what you are doing will impact generations to come. So we have to start thinking about generational ideas, not just the farmers that are going through this thing now or the four farmers. As you say, you put a stopgap measure in place for now, but then your idea or your thinking, what will they look like 50 years down the line? The whole notion of understanding by design, right? Consider what type of citizen do I want 50 years down the line? And that is where the whole CARICOM, citizen, etc., that whole idea comes from there. That you're thinking about what will they look like way down the line, not just now. And that is my only thing with reform. It is a process and it will take time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. If I read from page 40 of the same book, White Paper on Education Reform, which was written in 1995, it said the programs being offered at Earlston Teachers College will aim to equip teachers with the necessary skills and attitudes which will help them manage effectively the changes that will be occurring in the classroom. Surely they have not been trained to use technology. Obviously, we have so many teachers coming out of Earlston. They're coming out of your program, Dr. Marshall, and we still have a deficit in terms of computer use in a COVID environment. Okay, would you care to answer that question, sir?
Well, you said out of my program, but I should say to you, just a disclaimer earlier, Clark, that in my area of expertise, we focus on creating effective principles. As part of that process, we may speak to the issue of incorporating technology. But beyond that, I can say to you, without any fear of contradiction, that that really is not the focus of my program. There are other programs at universities that address that issue, but even beyond the university programming, I'm suggesting to you that even at the as you said, at the teacher training level and so on, that will have to be a policy initiative that seeks to incorporate these things from teacher training institutions all the way through. Because even if you were supposed to, let us say we did it, for example, at university, by the time, let us say if in 5 or 10 years, that technology or what you have learned will be obsolete by that time. So the only way you can address the issue of technological use is basically what they are doing now. They are running programs, MOOCs, etc., massive open online courses, and those types of short courses in the online environment that will speak to the immediacy of the needs of teachers in terms of being trained. So just what happened with the COVID environment, where people started using Kahoots and Loom and Animaker and those types of things, those are the things that will emerge, and there's no system of education that you can put in place that will address the immediacy of things like that, because technology is constantly changing. And the only way to get around that is to have built into your system now a program of continuous professional development. So that teachers from term to term or from semester to semester, they are required by, in terms of their job requirements, they are supposed to engage in some type of online training activity or something of the sort, so that they are always current in the classroom. Outside of that, it will be very, very difficult to even create a program that will deal with that. So the online method and those independent providers and so on will be the route that I will go there. I would say the only responsibility of the ministry there then will be to provide or facilitate training regimes of that nature. So in other words, when you have your budgets for your school, every year you can build into your budget, for example, a sum of money that is reserved specifically for professional development of your teachers in an online environment, something like that. And that can go from the primary level all the way to the secondary level. And that is the only way, to my mind, where you will be able to keep your teachers current in terms of the technology.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. We're short on
Moderator.
time. Yes,
Mr.
yes.
Moderator. Mr. Moderator.
Yes, sir. Yes, Dr.
Yeah, just one comment I want to make when following on from what Dr. Marshall spoke about with this 50-year plan in mind. What kind of citizen do we want to have in 50 years' time? My view is that we ought to have a short, medium, and long-term program of reform. Because while we are waiting to create this citizen of 50 years from now, the society, our young people are running riot, and the society is presently producing a kind of citizen that we are concerned about. So we do have to look at a reform that takes into consideration our present situation, then the medium term, and then of course the long term. So that's all I want to say there.
Just a quick clarification, moderator.
Go ahead, Dr. Marshall.
I beg your indulgence. Just to make the point that when they talk about a 50-year plan does not mean that between 0 and 49 years that there's precious little being done. The point we are making is that along the way, there will be obviously the interim measures that will be moving towards that 50-year goal. The point I'm making as well is that because you are thinking long-term, your thought processes and the programs that you put in place will not be seeking any short-term results. It will be like building capacity then. So let's say 50 years and I want you to be doing X or Y, I will be building capacity all during those 49 years. So by the time you get to the 50th year, you are already prepared. So don't misunderstand me when I say a 50-year plan, because the guy who ran the business all along between 0 and 49 years, what he was doing is that he was continuing to experiment with materials, he was experimenting with suppliers, etc. And every time he was just tweaking and tweaking till he got to the place where he eventually actually controlled the market in the area. But all along the way, there were benchmarks and milestones that he was supposed to reach, and he was reaching those. The point I made was that even though he himself did not live to see the 50-year plan, his son, who was also in the business, was able to bring the business to that level. Because obviously after 50 years, he was no longer physically able to be running the business, but his son was the one who actually achieved the goal. So I just want to make that clear, that a 50-year plan does not mean that you're negating interim success along the way.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. I'm going to take the last 3 questions one after the other. Candace, Griffith, Patron, and then Adrian. Let the questions flow, and then readers will ask the questions, and then we will wrap up. Candace, Griffith.
Yes, please. Good afternoon to the moderator, the panel, and the participants. You know you had to wait for your turn to come in. First, let me apologize for my technical difficulties and challenges I would have been having earlier. And then let me speak straight to what I want to speak about here is, you know, Dr. Marshall would have said that you have to have a systematic way of achieving reform. And my thoughts at the time that he said that were such that you had a case where a statement was made to the public about abolishing common entrance, and then we found that we couldn't do it. I'm saying it seemed as though research did not go into this process, and I want to say, you know, that we have to have some measure of research going into the process of reform, and that we have to also look at my thoughts. My questions to the panel then would be, how can we go about changing the mindsets that you would have spoken about that exist in the public, where people believe in the existing systems. People believe in common entrance and CXCs and the need for these things to be in place. How do we go about changing society's attachment to these examinations? And what suggestions can you put forward for the replacement of these examinations, or for the new systems of testing that we would put in place? Because when we look at reform altogether, yes, we will still need those testing systems to be in place, even though we're looking at a change, a transformation in how we do things. So what would be your suggestions? And I want to talk about the inclusion of technological advancements, which was one of the recent points made, because we seem to have a system here in Barbados where we resist certain things. For instance, we've been teaching online for some, or we haven't carried out a survey, anything real and quantitative to say, well, this or that is the real case concerning how online teaching is working or not working. So when we're looking at reform, we cannot only look at the views of those in let me put it in quotation marks, in power, those with the authority and charge over the system, but we have to depend heavily on research into what would be the best system. We can't just throw the idea of having middle school out there as though it's going to drop down from heaven and work on its own. But we really have to look at researching what is the best system for an island like Barbados and how we can move forward with the best systems, maintaining best practices, letting go of the things that we should, and having that reform to be effective. And as Mr. Goddard would have said, having that short-term implementation plan, a medium-term, and a long-term implementation plan. So those are my questions to the panel.
Thank you very much, Sister Griffin. I hope the panelists can remember those questions. We're going to, you all want to respond quickly? Anyone wants to respond quickly?
If I can address that, I think Candace, what the ministry has been doing for the last term in terms of the monitoring of online instruction, that is research that was being conducted to find out how the online environment was going and what are the issues and challenges that have arisen. And a lot of very rich information has been gathered, which can inform how the ministry goes forward with additional online instruction. So they have been doing research in that regard, but also in terms of the change in structures, there's research that is being carried out into other systems, how other systems work, what are the challenges that they have, what are the issues that arise, what are their social contexts as opposed to the social context of Barbados, what may be the challenges that we will encounter in terms of applying some of these systems to Barbados. So there is research going on. So when the ministry approaches the public, its various publics, with information about the decisions that are being made about what will happen, all of that will be buttressed by research based on the implementation of these things in other places and how they're likely to affect Barbados.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denny.
Moderator.
Mr. Goddard, you want to respond quickly? Yes, please.
Yeah, I want to respond quickly to Candace. The point about how do we change mindsets. You know, once the stakeholders have gone through research on these matters, you're talking about the common entrance exam, for example. You know, a point comes when you have to make the decision. No matter what you do, you are going to be unlikely to change a significant number of people's mindset. And therefore, you simply have to make a decision. In 1961, for example, there was a lot of resistance to free secondary education, you know. But you know what happened? The government of the day decided that that is what was going to happen. Of course, the people who were opposed to it were the people who were benefiting from the elitist educational system that we had, which excluded a large number of people. And the government simply implemented it, and over time, people began to accept it. Over time, people will accept the change. But if you continue to talk and talk and talk and complain that people's mindsets are not there yet, then we're not going to change. And the people will be where they are. Sometimes you have to be courageous enough and lead. That's what a government has. Sometimes you have to simply lead.
All right, thank you very much, Brother Goddard. I'm going to take the next two questions, and then we're going to ask the moderators to wrap up. Patrona?
Yes, good evening, panel. Good evening to everyone. Mine is not a question, really. It's just an observation in terms of the reform process within the secondary schools. I know that at the secondary schools, there is this closed and selection of subjects by students. Okay, you're directed in one particular vein. What happens when the child wants to return to a subject that he or she may have abandoned? Can they do that? Okay, they might be have received some sort of interest or stimulation vicariously, and they want to go back to that subject. there is a streamlining to all persons who are directed in particular way. You are science student. So therefore, you want to go into business. You can't do business studies. What about looking at those areas for the secondary school system? We know that later on, they do school-based assessments. But what about that project method approach that has been practiced and talked about for so long when children enter school, where they will be engaged in soft skills and so on, like cooperation and communication and time management and so on, where they have to actually work together. I find that a lot of people, we are so self, the individuality of persons. And then when later on in life, you want these same people to come together and work to achieve a particular goal. But somehow, when there's time for them to do so, they enter secondary schools, everybody is about getting the 90%, the 100%, and there's hardly any effort where those children can come together and produce something, the individual skills, the artist in the group, the public speaker in the group, okay, the planner in the group, the person who can collate and put together the information and make a good presentation. Those are some of the things I think reform in our secondary schools should go and probably begin. That is a contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warner. I'm now going to thank Mr. Wickham for being here. I know he cannot stay until the end. He has an engagement. I want to thank you very much, Mr. Peter Wickham. I'm not the one giving the vote of thanks, by the way, but I am doing it because you have to leave. We at the Barbados Union of Teachers appreciate your information, your participation in this effort, and we look forward to having some robust discussions in the future when we call on you. Thank you very much and enjoy yourself. So thank you very much. Mr. Adrian, you can speak now. Oh, no, sorry, Ms. Fowler, you can continue if you have your hands still.
Yeah. May I just quickly say something? Because I may have to go on now. Is it okay if you, moderator?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I made this extremely quick. I just want to say this forum, I hope and trust Master of Ceremonies that you all will go into having this a little more regular and hear from the great minds that I've heard from on here. Also, I want to quickly agree with Comrade Fabian Lewis. I enjoyed what he said, and what he said is so true. If the teachers could get together, they used to do that years ago. I remember they used to do that. I remember seeing that as a small boy growing up in the Scouts, when we used to have jamborees, when the Scouts was the Scouts. I used to see that many, many years ago. They don't have that kind of thing now. And my thing is to Comrade Goddard and Miss Denny, what she said, I totally agree with, right? If we want to have reform, they said that they told the Ministry of Education about reform. We're putting forward all these proposals and nice suggestions. My question is to all of you, including you, Mr. Moderator, is the ministry really listening? They are listening, but are they actually listening? Because we can put forward this beautiful thing that we have here, say everything under the sun. But what is going to happen, as I heard Mr. Peter Wickham echo earlier, you say all these lovely things, but then will we still be at the bus stop and not get any further? The library is deplorable. And what the gentleman said, I can't remember which one said it, what the gentleman said about the library, I totally agree. It needs help, and we need to do all that. And every person has a right to education. The late Earl Walton Barrow created free education for all. You understand? It don't matter if you go to Harrison College, Commonwealth, it don't matter. It don't matter. We had great students come out of a school. I don't know how many of you know a school named Unique High School. Had one of the best, in my opinion, one of the best headmistresses out. One by the name of Megan Greenwich. Top educator she was back then in those days. And in school they not like much, but a lot of first class students come out, and it doesn't matter. Some people got certificates, degrees, masters. Some of them ain't got the common sense. So they ain't got it on practical. They ain't got theoretically on paper. Practically, they ain't nowhere there. You put a mason and a plumber, can do far more, because that's where the money is. That's all I have to say. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you
All
very much.
bless everybody.
Patrona, Ms. Wola, you want to finish your presentation? You see your hands are in the air again. Ms. Wola, no.
No, I was telling Adrian, thanks for that, because I'm a product of Rudy High School.
Okay, very well. Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask the.
And so am I. I was a product of Unique High School as well.
Congratulations.
Right.
Yeah, all right. Might be older than you. I don't know.
I'm now going to ask the presenters to wrap up, to give us 1 minute of commentary. I'm going to start with Dr. Denny first. Dr. Denny?
Thank you, Mr. Lovell. I agree with a lot of your participants who said that they enjoyed the session. I was not sure that I was going to make it for 2 hours, and I've made it for almost 3 now. So I really enjoyed it. What I would like to say is that, and it is in response to the presentation made by Adrian just now. He asked if the ministry is serious. As was read in my bio at the beginning, I retired after 46 years to education in 2019. I don't have time to waste, and I cannot afford to be giving my time and effort in vain. So the fact that I have accepted the position to be chairman of the Reform Committee tells me that, or it should tell people who know me, that the ministry would have to be serious, because I would not agree to do something that I'm going to be wasting my time on. And I think that you can judge the seriousness of the ministry by the fact that the ministry has set up an education reform unit that is very shortly going to be established. And therefore, they recognize that in order to do what needs to be done, there needs to be staff dedicated to the whole idea of reform. But I want to make the point that I made at the outset. Reform is dynamic. It is not something that you can do now and come back to 25 years from now. So therefore, part of the reform has to be the establishment of structures which allow the ministry in its oversight role to see what needs to be tackled next, so that there can be the ongoing reform, so that reform can be weaved into the fabric of the education system, so that we won't be talking the next time we have one of these discussions about what happened 25 years ago. We will be talking about what happened last year, what changed after 2 or 3 years, because we recognize, because this thing is now woven into the fabric of education, we recognize that we need to tweak, we need to make changes, as Dr. Marshall is saying, along the road to the long-term goal. So yes, I think the Ministry of Education is serious, and I hope that when the ministry comes out and says, these are the things we must do, that all of the people who are very harsh on the ministry now will say, yes, the ministry is taking its role seriously and we have to give support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denny. Brother Goddard.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation again. And I want to thank all of the persons who made presentations for their input. I want to end by saying that we need to take seriously the mantra that our children's education is our greatest responsibility, and that therefore we need to create an environment to make sure that every child is able to develop his or her potential. The system, if we are going to improve the educational system, if we are going to create reform, we must decide that no examination at age 11 should influence what we do, first of all, in our primary schools. Our primary school teaching and learning in our primary schools must be influenced by the needs of the children. We should therefore be concerned when at the end of their primary school education, so many of our children cannot read and write. We must also be concerned with what happens in our secondary schools. We must provide opportunities in our secondary schools for all kinds of abilities to be catered to. And finally, I want to suggest to the governments of the Caribbean that, given the fact that the CXC is accountable to them, that they take the wise decision of telling CXC that an examination, CSEC and CAPE exam this year are not wise moves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Goddard. Dr. Marshall.
Yes, thank you again, Chair. I just want to end by reiterating or underscoring the point he made from the inception, which is this, that if we are serious about reform, then we need to be systemic about our reform. In other words, we must move away from first order change and get to what is called second order and even third order change, which requires us to look at to dismantle the system and to use the phrase of the president, build back better. Not just build back, but build back better. That's my final comment.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Sister Stacia Springer, who is the Secretary of Stewards, to offer the vote of thanks. Stacia.
Hi, good evening up to all. I deem it a great honor and privilege to propose the vote of thanks on this memorable occasion, the end of the Barbados Union of Teachers 47th Annual General Conference. I, on behalf of the President, executive members, and members of the Occupational Health and Safety Committee of the Barbados Union of Teachers, would like to express gratitude to all who have contributed to making this panel discussion entitled Education Reform in a COVID-19 Environment a Resounding Success. Let me first of all start by giving glory to the Almighty God for making this event possible. My heart goes out to thank our panelists, Dr. Idamay Denny, Chairman of the Education Reform Committee. Your point on the disengaged student is very applicable in these times. Mr. Peter Wickham, political analyst and talk show host, your concern on the Barbados Secondary School entrance examination will continue to be thought-provoking. Mr. John Goddard, veteran educator, as a teacher and a trained social worker, I totally agree with your point of the inclusion of social workers in schools and taking a closer look at a home and family life program. And Dr. Ian Marshall, lecturer at the University of the West Indies, I do agree that we need to look at education reform with a long scope. Reform cannot exist in a vacuum. I thank all of you for accepting our invitation and doing a fantastic job. Sincere thanks also goes out to our moderator, Mr. Rudy Lovell, second VP, who also made this session run smoothly. I also want to thank Ms. Stacia Burrows, Ms. Martinette King, and Mr. Dwayne Walker, members of the Barbados Union of Teachers Occupational and Health and Safety Committee, and our very own Chairman of Stewards, Mrs. Keisha Russell Graves, for presenting the panelists this evening. I also owe special gratitude to you, the audience, for your participation here this evening. Without you, there could have been no invigorating discussion. Last but not least, the technical crew for your behind the scenes work. If I have forgotten to thank anyone for the success of this panel discussion tonight, it's merely a slip of the tongue and not of the heart. Again, I thank you. Good night.
you very much, Stacia. Colleagues, I want to encourage you to come out whenever the union calls, whenever the union hosts any events, because this is what we're going to be doing going forward. We are trying to hold as many events, many sessions to educate our membership. We encourage you to continue to support the Barbados Union of Teachers. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks for coming.
Good evening. Thank you and good evening all.
All right, bye-bye.
Let's do this again.
Good evening, all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good evening to one and all.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Have a good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good session, Rudy.
All right, Rudy.
You really pull off one to make sure that you get good support and that you can trust the man tomorrow. But he's a good dog.
Herbert.
Oh, sorry.
Session,
Sorry, Rudy. Sorry, Rudy.
I pull out one.
Please don't mute Herbert, brother. No, Herbert, it is brother Lovell.
How can I mute Mr. Herbert Giddens? Boy.
Mr. Lovell, a very, very good session.
Thank you very much,
good
sir.
session. Excellent session. Right. All the kudos to you. Right?
Thank you
all the
very
kudos
much,
to you. To you and your committee, let me say that. Right. Yeah, we will. Yeah. So I wish you all the success tomorrow in the upcoming election.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. We'll speak later.
Yes, Rudy, it was indeed a good session. Very, very good. I'm sorry about my challenges earlier.
Good evening, colleagues. I'm going to bring the session to end because we are recording. I don't want to prolong the recording. I want to thank you very much for participating. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.